I can't control it, so, oh. No, it's okay? Okay. So, last class of the semester. Let's see, because university finals are coming up this week, and then commencement is on the 24th, the Ukiah, and then we all disperse for the summer. So how to disperse without scattering? This is sort of the challenge. I will make some suggestions tonight, whether these are acceptable to you or not. It's kind of what I do during the summer. I read. I sit like this. I walk. I'm walking more gingerly now, more sitting and reading, and spend time with some friends and nature. So nature, friends, and when I read, I mean read a text, a sutra, do some meditation, and walk. And when we come back in September, we should be pretty much close to in sync. Share with you a passage. This is from the Lunyu, from Confucius, that I really like. And he says, to study and at times put it into practice, is this not pleasure? And to have friends come from afar, is this not a joy? Those are the first two lines. And I've had colleagues and friends, when we get together, they quote these lines, whether it's on the East Coast or whatnot. But the combination of studying and actually putting into practice, living these texts, he says is pleasure. This is very interesting. It's not renunciation, but it's a kind of delight. And to having friends, by this he means good, close, friends that know your sound, so to speak. They say in Chinese, 知音, that know you almost without speaking. To have them come from afar, or for you to go to afar and meet with them, either way, is this not a joy? And the last line is very interesting, the third part of this. And to not be offended if nobody recognizes your virtue. Is this not an exemplary person? That third one usually gets left out, but I really like the three of them. Study, put into practice, friends come from afar, enjoy them, and then don't take offense if nobody notices your virtue. And this is, to be a full person. So anyways, I thought I'd share that with you because it's a recurring goal or aim of me as I get older. The thing about the sutras, and I said don't share the text tonight because we've been through the sutra, but I wanted to say something about sutras in general tonight. I never actually heard of such a thing until the 1970s when I first came to Gold Mountain Monastery. I had no idea. I never heard the term. And then my introduction was every morning we would get up then it was 4 o'clock and do the morning ceremony. And right in the middle of the morning ceremony, there'd be a pause where whoever was leading the cantor, so to speak, leading the ceremony, would pause and read a section of a sutra. And in that case, back then it was the Platform Sutra, the Six Patriarchs Dharma Jewel Platform Sutra. And I just found this wonderfully insightful, refreshing, new, and yet very familiar at the same time. And it would only be maybe a 5-minute read at most. But then the rest of the day, you kind of chew on that, think it over, let it penetrate. Anyhow, the next thing I noticed that was my teacher, Master Hua, was lecturing on sutras sometimes 2 and even 3 or more times a day. And so while we were staying at the monastery, while we were traveling, he would always be lecturing, explaining a sutra text. We had the this text that we've been doing here, the Avatamsaka, but the Shurangama Sutra, the Lotus Sutra, Sutra in 42 sections, the Platform Sutra, and so forth. And then he would invite guest monks and nuns and scholars to come in and do the same. But the platform was always, in service to these ancient texts. Moreover, when he was teaching us, he was always quoting the text, not necessarily, say, in the lecture form, but connecting the principles of the text to the concrete specifics of our life, our encounters. And so it was like, in a sense, I say this with all due respect, he was like a walking Tripitaka. Tripitaka being the three baskets, the Vinaya, the Shastras, and the Sutras. And a great many of these he had committed to memory. And so, but not only had he committed them to memory, he could at a particular time point to some specific behavior event, the death of a friend, the celebration of something, an anguish, a delight, a frustration, and then put that sutra quote on top of that. And often it was sutra, but it could be from the Taoist canon, the Confucian canon. And as a result, we got to see this deep interweave between our lives, which we thought were kind of new, modern, and very different from the past, actually woven into the fabric of these ancient teachings. And it gave us a perspective and a window that we didn't have. As I went on, and as I've been doing this more, I'm struck by how most of the great teachers I'm reading, both traditions, the Theravada and the Mahayana, use this technique, that one of their primary forms of practice, maybe think of them as meditators, and of course they did do that. But equally, or maybe even more so than their meditation, was a study they devoted to the sutra text. And this gets overlooked a great deal, especially people in the Chan or the Zen tradition feel as if, oh, it's just sitting. But if you look at the early monasteries where Chan and Zen was practiced, there was an equal amount, even more attention devoted to the study and, how shall I say, absorption of the principles, the theory. And then the meditation was on top of that. But it wasn't an either or, never was that. So to divorce those two, what Jiri said, is like having one wing on a bird. You need to have both of them together. So even people that think, oh, Zen and Chan monasteries were just about prolonged sitting, they weren't. There was a great deal of study that went on there. So when I looked at the person we're looking with now is Han Chan De Ching, is about the time of Shakespeare, noted for his meditation practice. I mean, he was way up there in terms of, and yet he was also way up there in his scholarship. And so when you read his biography, and we're working on that, I'm writing a long introduction to his life and philosophy, he was intimately, as if the texts were living beings to him, living teachers to him. Shu Yun, Empty Cloud, the same way, my teacher. They read, they memorized, they relied on, they steered by and validated their experience by these texts. That was their good and wise advisors. They also lectured and explained it again and again. And towards the end, most of them, it's very interesting, devoted their lives to lecturing, explaining sutras, and rebuilding monasteries. Those two activities became, towards the end of their lives, their primary focus of attention. So this to me is a very interesting phenomena. And because the nature of the way it was studied wasn't simply the way we might study for an exam or study for a certain acquisition of knowledge, but it was studied to actually be transformed through and by the text itself. In other words, after the reading the text, it wasn't just what do you think it meant, but it was how is you meant to be different after reading the text. How was the text supposed to have an impact on you? So this is like the dialectic that was involved in their section. One thing very interesting I came upon, I may have told you about this earlier, but The famous forest monk who restarted the forest tradition in the Theravada, who was, come on, Ajahn Mun, right, Ajahn Mun. I'll read you a section. This is from his biography. It's kind of interesting to read. When he began practicing Vipassana, he meditated constantly, internally repeating the word Buddho, the recollection of the Buddha, as he preferred this preparatory Dharma theme to above all others. In the beginning, he failed to experience the degree of calm and happiness that he expected, which caused him to doubt whether he was practicing correctly. Despite his doubt, he didn't flag in his persistent use of the word Buddho, and eventually his heart developed a certain measure of calm. So, lesson to us, if your meditation isn't working, you're not working it. So do not jump to the conclusion that it's not working. Rather, jump or lead yourself to the conclusion that you're not really working it. The Dharma wheel is something you turn, it doesn't turn you. But then, one night he has this dream, and I want to relate this dream to you. He walked out in the dream, he walked out of a village and entered a large, dense jungle overgrown with tangled undergrowth. He could hardly find his way to penetrate it. He struggled to find his way through this vast thicket until he finally emerged safe at the other end. And when he came out, he found himself at the edge of an immense field that stretched as far as the eye could see. He set out resolutely, walking across the field until he happened to come across a huge fallen jati tree. I don't know what a jati tree is. Anybody? J-A-T-I, a jati tree? Okay. It's a large tree. It was felled long ago and its trunk was partially embedded in the ground, and most of its bark and sapwood had already rotted away. He climbed upon this giant jati log and walked along its full length, and as he walked, he reflected inwardly. He realized that this tree would never sprout and grow again. He compared this to his own life, which would certainly not rise again in any future existence. He identified the dead jati tree with his own life in samsara. Seeing that the tree had rotted away, never to root and spring to life again, he reckoned that by keeping his diligent practice, he would surely find a way to reach a definite conclusion to his own life, its very existence. And it goes on. The vast expanse of the open field symbolized the nature of a never-ending cycle of birth and death. So he's interpreting his own dream. Go on with this. By the way, for reading this summer, you can read biographies and autobiographies. That's just as maybe as interesting as the sutras. As he stood on the log contemplating this, a broad white stallion trotted up and stood next to the fallen jati tree. As it stood there, Acharya Mun felt an urge to ride it. So he mounted the mysterious horse, which immediately raced off at full gallop. He had no idea where he was being taken or why. The horse just continued galloping at full speed without showing any obvious sign of direction or purpose. The distance it traveled across the vast field seemed immeasurable, and as they strode along, Acharya Mun saw a beautiful Tripitaka cabinet. Tripitaka, again, to repeat, is the collection of the teachings, sutras, shastras, and Vinaya. His tradition would have been sutras, Abhidharma, and Vinaya. He saw this huge cabinet in the distance adorned with exquisite silver trim. Without guidance, the horse led him directly to the enclosed bookcase and came to a halt right in front of it. The moment Acharya Mun dismounted with the aim of opening the cabinet, the white stallion vanished without a trace. And as he stepped towards the bookcase, he noticed that it was standing at the very edge of the field with nothing in the background but more of the dense jungle, entangled and smothered with undergrowth. He saw no way of penetrating it. And when he came to the Tripitaka cabinet, he reached out to open it. Before he had a chance to discover the contents in his side, he woke up. Now, his later interpretation of this, he calls this a nimitta, or a sign. But he saw it as an indication that because he didn't have the requisite training that included a really good teacher and access to deep study of the Tripitaka, he faltered and floundered in his practice. And he regretted later that he didn't make progress as speedily and clearly enough because he didn't have access to this. He didn't have access to the studying of the text. So I just bring this up for those, I was quoting those who used it and relied on it, but those who also didn't have it regretted the fact that they didn't. So then I was thinking, Xuanzang, who's Xuanzang? Anybody know Xuanzang? I mean, you wouldn't know Xuanzang, but know about Xuanzang? Yes, who's Xuanzang? When did he do that? Do you know? Yeah, I know. This is history again. A long time ago, yeah. What time? How about in the 600s? Yeah, 600s of the Common Era. We don't say AD anymore. You know that, right? It's no longer correct. You got to go CE, Common Era. AD is what I grew up with. Because Buddhism was coming into China at this time from all these different sources, including Central Asia, and it wasn't coming in any systematic way. Sometimes they had text, sometimes they didn't. So he made this pilgrimage to India. If you want to read about it, it's actually recorded called Journey to the West. It's not the Pigsy, but that's a variation of that. But the real Journey to the West, why is it called Journey to the West? Because it was west of China, right? Yeah. Actually, it was to the east. From our point of view, he went to India. That would have been the east, but his point of view, he's going west. This is also a Chan thing. Which way is north, south? It depends. The Chan thing, are your nostrils pointing up or down? It's one of the meditation topics. Anyhow, I'm not going into that. So he went back, and he wanted to pay homage to these places, so he went to all these monasteries and kept an incredible anthropological record of his journeys, which gives us a lot of information what Buddhism was like in the early days of the post-Shakyamuni time in India. 17 years he devoted to this going, and he did another difficulty. He mastered Sanskrit. Now, any of you who tried to master Sanskrit, whoa. So he was so good at Sanskrit that they had now I'm diverging, but these are all fun stories. You should read his autobiography or his Journey to the West, because it's really filled with incredible information and tales of wonder. That's a good summer read. You could read that and then read Monkey alongside. That would get you through most of the summer, especially time with the New York Times. Anyhow, he got so good at Sanskrit they had a debate competition with a Sanskrit scholar at the time, because he went to Nalanda University to study, which was the greatest university in the world at the time. Precedes Oxford and Cambridge, both in time and scope. And he won the debate. He won the debate. Can you imagine that? A foreigner winning the debate with using Sanskrit. What was his prize? First of all, he got an elephant. And secondly, he got a year's supply of this incredibly fragrant, rich rice that was a treasure of a local growing community. So I don't know what happened to the elephant. On one hand, it's a gift, and other things, it could be a hardship. But in any event, maybe he traded it in. He might have traded it in because he came back with numerous Sanskrit texts on a caravan of 20 pack horses. Some of those were lost en route. When he went over certain passes where the ground was treacherous, one or two of the pack horses slipped over the side with their whole collection of these Dharma treasures and slid in, never to be seen again. So I was thinking about this when I said read a sutra this summer. 17 years of hardship, and now all I have to do is do this, and I got the entire Tripitaka at my fingertip through the internet and what's available now. So on one hand, we're very, very lucky, but it doesn't mean that we avail ourselves of it anymore. Maybe he actually treasured it and did more reading of it than we would with our unlimited access to it. Anyhow, the idea of a sutra, anybody know the origins of that term? Sutra is actually a Sanskrit term. Yeah, you're doing your sewing. It's a thread or a string, and it's that which holds or thread things together. Sort of, it weaves knowledge into a tapestry or fabric, holds it together. It's a holding pattern. It also has another root word from the Sanskrit, which means well-spoken. So it's not only strings things together, but well-spoken. The well-spoken probably derives from the fact that the tradition for 300 to 500 years was orally transmitted. It was spoken. It wasn't written down. Only later did it get, woven in. And usually it was translated by centuries from teacher to student, recited, often communally, mostly communally recited, not individually, was memorized, and it was chewed on and ingested. And basically it kind of provided a map for cultivators who was given these essential guidelines for navigating a meaningful life towards liberation. So that's what it was about. This is very interesting because when you look at one of the monks in my seminar at the university, we were talking about what is Dharma, what is Dharma, and how do you tell it's authentic and the true teaching and whatnot, and where does authority reside? And the scholars ask a question, in the absence of the Buddha, where does authority reside? And the big question was, when the Buddha's passing away, Ananda gets kind of freaked out and says, oh my God, we're losing our teacher. We don't have any teacher anymore. What are we going to do? And he goes to the Buddha and says, what are we going to do when you're gone? And the Buddha's first answer to him is, you're not thinking about this straight. But basically what he's saying is, in the presence of the Buddha, where does authority reside? What have I taught you? I've taught you to look into yourselves, because the Buddha is your own nature. It's not outside. So therefore, my passing doesn't mean you don't have a teacher. Then he said, take the Dhamma Vinaya as your teacher when I'm gone. But this monk was pointing out this section called, a text called Bakali, where the Bakalis has the same anxiety about the teacher going and there's no teacher anymore. And the Buddha says this to Bakali, he says, who sees the Dharma of Bakali sees me. And who sees me sees the Dharma. Truly seeing the Dharma, one sees me. Seeing me, one truly sees the Dharma. This is a really important passage, because what the Buddha is saying is, I am just a manifestation or a carrier of this abiding truth, the way things are. It is not me that's the authority. I'm just passing this along and reflecting it. So this brings us back to, if you can, because a lot of people feel, oh gosh, now we're in 2025 or whatever, all the great teachers are gone. There's no place. We're like Ananda in a sense, feeling like we don't have. And if we listen to what this teaching was, we get the idea, it's not gone. It's actually closely found in these texts. Now that leads to maybe the idea, the closest we get to a good and wise advisor these days is to deeply, and the expression is deeply enter the sutra treasury and have wisdom like the sea. So you go into this treasury, lose yourself in it. And I'm feeling more and more over time, even though I had a good teacher and my teachers passed on, at all times he did not point to him, but pointed to the teachings as a source of guidance and authority. And even said, if I don't measure up to the teachings, don't follow me. So it's very interesting that this continues. So even though you maybe not had access to, you had access to what he had access in following. And so in a sense, you're following what he was following rather than just following him. Which is why our method is to constantly bring the sutras up for class. I mean, I can talk about my personal experiences and everything, but they're only important in the sense that they reveal something from the sutra text itself. By the way, I use the word text. What's the origin of that? That's not a Sanskrit word, right? Come on. Use your brains. Huh? Textile. Very good. Where textile comes from text. Text is textile. Huh. So textile is a thing woven. To weave and join to fit together. To braid, to interweave. Fabricate, to build. So sutra and text. And the word is used now for, you could say a sutra is a text. A jing, the Huayan jing, text or sutra. And both will work as that which weaves together. It comes from someone way back called Quintilian. Anybody remember Quintilian? He was the president before Bush. Way before what? He was an orator. He had an institutio oratioria. Anyhow, he said, after you've chosen your words, they must be weaved together in a fine and delicate fabric. And that became the basis then for text. So it's a web, a canvas, something woven. So if I could move on a bit from that, the thing where how many of you actually are actively studying a sutra now on your own, not just on the Friday night? The hands kind of shoot up a little bit. Yeah. Okay, so which sutra? Heart Sutra. What sutra? You don't have to go through the list and be impressive. Just name one. Which one? Shurangama. Okay, anybody else? I saw a finger. Yeah, go. The Vajra Sutra. Okay. Yes. Shurangama. Mm-hmm. Anybody else over here? Heart Sutra. Shurangama. Okay. There are so many. There are so many, and we are blessed at this phase to have not just one, but many translations of the text. If you can, and move your study along, try to acquire some of the early original language and look at the translation with a critical eye. In other words, as you read the translation in English, don't assume that it nailed it. Because all translations are interpretations, and all interpretations are coming through biases, thought ways, insights of the translator. So the translation is only as good as the translator, and the translator is not just only as good as their language philological base, but their cultivation as well. In other words, to translate living wisdom, you have to have a wisdom flow in your body, in your being. Otherwise, you get the letter, but you miss the spirit or the meaning. So if you can study these, Sanskrit, Pali, let's just start there, or Chinese, or if you have some Chinese, you might have the Chinese that isn't classical, so you have to kind of refurbish it. But you can go in and look at a couple, especially the Heart Sutra. The Heart Sutra, it can be recited depending within 35, 40 seconds or a couple minutes. But then if you compare the English to the Chinese, and you can do it as a study because there's not that many, you can kind of say, why did they translate it that way? Why did they translate it this way? Is there another way of doing it? And you can get into it, and you can get a creative access to it. It comes alive for you working with the translation. Anyhow, it's funny, when I go up to Maine every summer, I always end up with the Heart Sutra. And this is like 50 years. So I'm a slow learner. I'm up there in the wilderness, and something about the Heart Sutra calls out. When Shariputra, when Guanyin Bodhisattva was practicing Xing, Shun, Bo, Ro, deeply practicing, not studying, but practicing Prajnaparamita, illuminated and saw through illuminated seeing. The five skandhas were all empty, and then basically crossed over all suffering and difficulty. That's how it begins. And there's something about that text that just keeps coming back and keep coming back and keep trying to penetrate it. Maybe that's why it's called the heart of the Prajnaparamita. It's the actual essence of the whole Prajnaparamita tradition. So if you can commit that to memory, and Chinese and English, and then just chew on it and work on it and contemplate it, yeah, it's wonderful. What can I say? One of the things that happened for us, I mentioned at Go Mountain, we did the Platform Sutra, which is very accessible. So if you haven't read or looked at that one, definitely look at Wei Nung's Platform Sutra. I told you when Master Hua first came to the United States, he was carrying a whole packet full of those in Chinese and gave them to David Rounds, basically, and said, translate. David knew no Chinese at the time, and was, why did he bring that one over? One, because he had a visionary dream of Hui Nung telling him to come to America. That was one thing. But in conjunction with that, he said, and I remember him saying this text has everything you need to know to become a Buddhist. Not only that, it has everything you need to know to become a Buddha. So that's how direct and accessible the Platform Sutra is, I think, especially for sort of a modern Western approach. But Heng Sure and I were gravitated to the Avatamsaka, and when we first started, it seemed so out there, you know, almost irrelevant. And Sherpa's instructions, Master's instructions on our bowing pilgrimage was to bow single-mindedly all day long, and then at night study and translate the Avatamsaka Sutra, which is exactly what we did. He said, you're like Sudna going from teacher to teacher, page to page, chapter to chapter. And so at night, you know, you guys would be amazed. I was thinking about this today. There was no phones then, by the way. I mean, you're out there, there's no smartphones, there was no flip phones, there was no digital anything. And so at the end of the day, we just lit the kerosene lamp, a storm, you know what do you call them, a storm lamp in the glass thing, and opened the sutra text and sat very close together because it doesn't give off much light. Fortunately, the characters were like that big. It was, we had the whole, and then we would go into it. And Master Hua said, well, Heng Sure's got a vow of silence, but at night he can teach you Chinese through the sutra. And then he looked at me and he said, and during the day you can teach him Tai Chi. You teach him Tai Chi, he teaches you the sutra. I don't think I learned that much Chinese. And I doubt that he learned much Tai Chi. But we did have a good time going into the sutra and translating it. And the interesting thing is the bowing softened us. That's the only word I can use. The sutra began to open. And it was almost like a third person with us on that pilgrimage at night with that sutra. And I wanted to quote for you because this is something Master Hua, at his heart, his approach to the sutras is I think, captured in these couple paragraphs I'm going to read to you. And this is how he taught us all. He says, and I'm quoting this, the principles expounded in the Flower Adornment Sutra are all Dharma doors, which are not separate from our daily activities and concerns. Not only are the principles of the Avatamsaka not separate from the daily round of our ordinary lives, but the other sutras are also not separate from the principles which we require to live in our daily lives. If the principles discussed by the sutras had no relevance to the daily lives of each and every one of us, the Buddha would never have spoken these sutras. The Buddha spoke the sutras to enable each of us to live good lives, proper and regular lives, lives very much in accordance with Shila, ethics and morality. That is why he spoke all the Dharma doors and lectured all the sutras. Each sutra is presenting us with an authentic, proper road along which to travel. However, we must go along it for the sutras to be of use. So this was the other thing. The roads present, in the Midwest we used to use the expression, my grandfather, you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. This is the same thing here. You can show the road, and you can lay it out, but without walking it, it's not a road. If we only know the sutras and do not rely upon the sutras to cultivate, then we can listen to the sutras for 80,000 great kalpas, but it will be equivalent to not ever having heard them at all. And then he quotes from the Lotus. They had eyes but did not see Nishyananda Buddha. They had ears but not hear the perfect sudden teaching. So he concludes, the principles discussed in the sutras are designed to correct our faults and bad habits. It's absolutely not the case that the sutra was dharma spoken for bodhisattvas with no relation to us, or that it was spoken for arhats with no relevance to us. Don't think, oh, I'm just an ordinary person. All I can do is listen to the sutra. I could never aspire to the states of a sage. To think that way is to throw yourself away, to separate yourself from the sages. Consequently, in our daily investigation and lecturing of the Avatamsaka, it's essential to rely upon the sutra's principles to cultivate and use the sutra as a cure. Now he's using the medicinal, as a cure for our own personal faults. Those who are greedy after hearing the sutra should rid themselves of greed. Those who have hatred and anger after hearing the sutra should get rid of their hatred and anger. And those who are stupid and upside down should get themselves squared away and smart. Now smart he meant in the virtuous sense, not just clever smart. So this was the heart of his teaching, how he used the sutras. And I offer this as a kind of guideline in your own reading of the text. What does this have to do with me? What is this telling me about me? How am I to be different or see things differently or think differently after reading this, after thinking about this, after going into it? The word that comes to mind is there's a thing called a chintamani. Chintamani. Anybody know what a chintamani? You know, Om Mani Padme Hum. You know that mani. Chintamani. Chintamani is a symbol indicating supposedly an efficacious jewel that manifests one's wishes. It brings your wishes true, curing disease and so forth. In the Pure Land, the Chintamani is the recitation of the Buddha's name with one thought unconfused, single-mindedly reciting Amitabha Guanyin, which you might think, oh, that's just kind of other devotional practice, but actually it's mind ground changing. So the verse goes like this: when the water clearing pearl, the mani pearl, is tossed into muddy water, the muddy water becomes clear. When the Buddha's name enters the confused mind attains Buddha. So that recitation is like a mani jewel. I'm making the extension here that the sutras themselves are like dropping a mani jewel into your consciousness, dropping into the waters of your mind. And it will, not just in its content, but even its imagery and its sound, especially if you recite it, transform and purify and clear up the water. It's really quite something. Anyway, I was going to read, and I can't do it because there's not enough time tonight. So I'm going to sip a little tea here, take a break, and end with some stuff. What I was going to read to you, and maybe I'll start. Oh, here's my suggestion. So everybody this summer, hang out with good friends from afar or near, read a sutra and deeply enter the sutra treasury, go for walks, lose yourself in nature for a bit, and then when you come in the fall, you can all share your experiences. So the first class in the fall, everybody will have to share what that summer was like combining these elements. How? Okay? So you have to do it. Like I say, and if you don't come on the first class, we're going to call you online, and you'll be streaming in live to tell what happened. Well, I didn't do the sutra treasury. I didn't even go into the baby pool because, okay. Life's too short, carpe diem. Don't waste your time reading a lot of stuff that's like dental floss. Just go through your teeth and you toss it out again. It's entertaining. Stephen King and all these, yeah. And at the end, none of this has any purchase on your consciousness. None of this retains any value. It's just distraction. Um, the French word for this is called divertissement. They call it, that's a word for entertainment. Read something that transforms and that simply entertains. But what I was going to read you, and I'll read it, at the end of his pilgrimage, Sudana reaches his final goal, which is back to Manjushri, and he's at the foot of Maitreya's tower, which is the pinnacle of his pilgrimage, and he has this incredible reflection I was going to read to you tonight, but there's not enough time, about how he changed his whole being by entering deeply into this Dharma treasury. By the time he got here, he was no longer the person that began his pilgrimage. He was completely transformed by this encounter with the Dharma. And I think, in a sense, you should see Sudana, if you want to read it closely, as yourself. Don't read it as a story about him or about somebody else. In the Vajra Sutra, don't read it Subhuti as sort of no, you are Subhuti. You are Sudana. You're Shariputra, you're Ananda, and you enter into their mind and their consciousness and feel as if the sutra is engaging and talking to you, and you can ask questions back of the sutra and get into a creative dynamic where the sutra is speaking back and forth to you. If you can do it in this way, the sutra will be constantly alive, and you will be always in the presence of this really good sagely energy. So you have to sort of impose yourself into that and see yourself as one of those sitting at the foot of a Buddha. Anyhow, next time we'll do Maitreya's Tower, because it's really, but what I wanted to do was just share some closing things tonight, maybe a poem. This is from Shu Yun, Empty Cloud, and we've talked about him before. Everybody familiar with Shu Yun? Yeah, he along with Master Hua, this is an aside, are really being paraded as Dharma jewels for China. And all I will say is, no prophet is honored in his own country, if I to quote in other words, posthumously everybody gets honored, but in their lifetimes it's not always the case. If you speak truth to power and you manifest a body that speaks the Dharma, it's not the case that you will be glad-handed and welcomed everywhere. Shu Yun was beaten near to death 3 times in his life by the authorities, let's put it this way. Master Hua, Shu Yun told Master Hua to come to the West, so Master Hua came. Nonetheless, their presence and their character and their virtue is not always welcomed with open arms by those in power. So this is just something that goes. Afterwards, of course, then they're deified and made into saints and honored. So, what was the last line from Confucius this morning? Not to be honored for your virtue, but take no offense. That's exemplary. Yeah. Anyhow, this is from Shu Yun. Lived to be about 120. Oh gosh, I had another thing I was going to read you. I forgot. This is incredible. John Blofeld went and interviewed Shu Yun towards the end of his life. I wanted to read that and I forgot. Well, we got stuff to start out. It's an incredible interview because he comes in as just this sort of bold Westerner, like, what are you doing? I heard you're enlightened and so forth. And thus begins this exchange with the Venerable Shu Yun towards the end. Anyhow, no time. Here's his advice. He said, set the time of sitting. He's giving advice to you. Set the time of sitting. In other words, do it every day. You eat, you sleep, you wear clothes. Maybe you shower every day. Maybe you don't. But sit every day and see it just as ordinary and normal as eating, sleeping, and wearing clothes. But he said, set the time and do it, because if you don't set the time, you'll be whipped around by your whims. Oh, I don't think it's too early. I'll do it after dinner. Right. Oh, there's that Netflix series. And the day is gone, and you haven't sat. So see it as that essential. He says, set the time of sitting. Make it as long as it takes one fragrant insect stick to burn down. Now, you can start with the nice ones that are like that. You get those in the cute boxes, or you can do these. You know, often in the ancient monasteries, you come in for the Chan retreat and you look at the incense holder and you knew what you were in for. If they had these, humongous, because it was one sit for the insect. You go, oh my gosh, can I offer some of these itty-bitty tiny? But he says, as long as it takes one stick to burn, don't even use the clock. Now, if you're really doing it, you won't even notice the incense went out. That's wonderful. But if you do notice, you'll see it's not going to cheat. It's not going to burn faster because you want it to, or burn slower. And in that time it takes to burn that incense stick down, he says, you can thread the principles, the basic principles of Buddhism, thread them together in a lovely string of pearls. So sit regularly, set the time, one stick burn, and in that time you can thread together, again, thread together the basic principles. What are you doing? You're creating a sutra of your own making from your own nature. You bring the principles together, and he says a lovely string of pearls. Here's another one where he talks about, and if I had time I'd go into more because Ajahn Chah talks about this too, of using nature as a meditation technique or a mirror, as a sutra almost. And so here you have Shuyan again, he says to a scholar, you've traveled up 10,000 steps in search of truth. So many days in the archives, copying. This is what scholarship used to be, not downloading, actual copying. And not AI was doing it, you were actually doing it. So many days in the archives, copying. The gravity of the tongue, the profundity of the sung makes heavy baggage. So you're taking these 2 long periods of time and copying them down and carrying all this, literary knowledge and so forth. And then he says, here, I picked you a bunch of wild flowers. Their meaning is the same, but they're much easier to carry. It's just a wonderful poem. He's saying basically everything is speaking this Dharma, this wonderful Dharma, if we only observe and stop to pause and see it, even a bunch of wildflowers. Don't go basically away from the 4 truths. The thought that came to mind, everything speaks of Dharma, sometimes even words do. And now I have one of my favorites from Tao Yan Ming. When was Tao Yan Ming? Anybody on that one? Connie, you want to guess? Tao Yan Ming? Not the tongue. He was born in 365. Yeah, and he died in 427. How old would it make him? Math. Nobody? To be past 35 in that era was to have a long life. So 465, 427, roughly 70 years, right? A long time. So here is a summer reflection. And then I'm going to give you 2 translations, and you can see how somebody who works with the Chinese can just turn it slightly. I'm very fond of poetry. He says, I built my hut in a zone of human habitation, yet near me sounds no noise of horse or coach. How could that be possible? And then he says, a heart that is distant creates a wilderness around it. I pluck chrysanthemums under the eastern hedge and then gaze long at the distant summer hills. The mountain air is fresh at the dusk of day. The flying birds, 2 by 2, return. In these things there lies deep meaning. Yet, when we would express it, words suddenly fail us. So he's observing. 2 lines that jump out at me is like, how in the midst of busyness, Berkeley, San Francisco, Los Angeles, wherever, that you can have a noiseless, silent space. He says, a heart that is distant, a heart that is removed and not attached, creates a wilderness around it. And that's also Thoreau's meaning. He says, in wilderness lies the preservation of society, of humanity. He didn't mean the vast tracts of national park and forest. He meant something simply as your backyard, where you're close to flowers and trees. And if you can surround yourself with that, wilderness is near you. So that's one translation. That was by Arthur Waley. Arthur Waley in about 1920. Here's one from the 1970, 50 years later. Same poem. And it goes like this. I built my hut beside a traveled road, yet hear no noise of passing carts or horses. You would like to know, how is that done? With the mind detached, one's place becomes remote. The straight mind is the right way place from Huineng. Picking chrysanthemums by eastern hedge, I catch sight of the distant southern hills. The mountain air is lovely as the sun sets, and flocks of flying birds return together. In these things is a fundamental truth. I would like to tell it, but lack the words. So this is by James Hightower, 1970. So both poems from Tao Ming. So again, whatever you read for the summer, you can read biographies, autobiographies, Journey to the West, and Monkey, read and go into a sutra, or pick up some poetry. And poetry is the closest you're going to get to getting at truth with a minimum and thinness of words. Yeah, it's almost like a picture. Anyhow, I had a lot more I could have done, but tonight's done, and you need to get on with your remote, busy lives, however that works. But I do hope you have a prosperous, meaningful, and enjoyable summer. All things being equal, we will be back again in September to pick up with the Avatamsaka. Any announcements or questions? And I promise I will share those things I left out tonight. No questions, no announcements. Yes? Graduation on the 24th, commencement. You're all welcome to attend up in Ukiah. There's usually some very good food after the commencement, so even though the speeches are not always tasty, the food afterwards is scrumptious. One of the nuns, I won't mention who, really has a hand for making scrumptious food. In fact, I once passed one of her tests. I'm just telling you this. We had a gathering at our cottage up there, and I said I'd provide the dumplings. He says, yeah, right. And I took the dumplings, and I made a special sauce and a special way of making them. And she came back for thirds. And she said, not bad. So she prepares some of the food at commencement. It's always usually good. There's 2 retreats happening this summer. Oh, the 30th. When is that? A book fair tomorrow. And there's a 30th anniversary coming up, right?
31st, May 31st.
When is Memorial Day? Oh, okay. And then there's a retreat at the Suna Center, and there's a retreat at Buddha Root Farm, which is up in Oregon in the woods, which reminiscent of these poems tonight. And then anything else? The what? And the Guanyin session. After which there will be the full awakening of everybody present in this room, of which we will commemorate. And then that'll become an anniversary thing next year at the same time. When 25 went off to not nirvana, but the end of samsara. Okay, no questions? Anything? Yes. Mm-hmm.
I read that he burnt one of his fingers to dedicate to his late mother, right?
I heard that too.
Yes. And I was always thinking, if I were his mom, I'd be very unhappy that he would burn his finger.
Mm-hmm.
It's for me. So what's up with this story?
You'd
Please
have
tell
to
me.
ask him and his mom. I have no clue as to what that was really all about. I do know with Han Shan De Ching, his mother wanted him to become a monk, and his mother wanted him to become the emperor. And she gave him that message throughout his life. Talk about cognitive dissonance. And he became a monk, and there was this tension all throughout. And they didn't resolve that tension until almost at the end of his life in his late 50s when they had one last meeting. And there was finally a reconciliation of those tensions. So I think between monks and nuns and parents, there's all kinds of things going on. And this may be one example of how he dealt with it or approached it. Yeah, that's all I can say. I can't say any more. Wish I could. There was something else? Locke, did you have something? Oh, yeah. No? Yes.
I was wondering if you had any exposure to Jesuit pedagogy. You mentioned Quintilian and their Eloquentia Perfecta
Spiritual exercises?
focus. Good people speaking well has Quintilian as one of the three primary people they study, the other two being Cicero and Aristotle.
I would say, yes, bittersweet exposure to Jesuits and Franciscans and Augustinians and the Sisters of Mercy and the Sisters of Notre Dame. I come from a very deep Catholic formation. Some of my most formative spiritual experiences were retreats within those traditions, something they used to call Cursillo. And we've had many continuing exchanges between Buddhist Catholic dialogues going way back and continuing into the present. In fact, right up at Redwood Vihar now, the monk who's in charge from the Vatican of that dialogue is an old friend of ours, and he's up there at Redwood Vihara now. And we go back, we used to do them at Mercy Center in Burlingame, and then we did a Gethsemane Encounters at Thomas Merton's place. And so there's very much an overlap between the contemplative traditions of the Chan Zen Buddhist and those coming from the monastic contemplative tradition, including the Jesuits. So there's, at the beginning stages, and depending how sincere you are, there's almost no difference as you move along. It's only when you get to the deepest parts that the theology starts to diverge. And I could go into that more, but someone did a study once and found that if you have devotional, contemplative, ritual, all the various religious expressions, you'll find more correspondence horizontally between traditions than you will vertically. So the difference between a fundamentalist and a contemplative in one tradition is more marked than a contemplative and contemplative across traditions. And so basically, in the Buddhist sense, all roads lead to Rome in a sense that all streams lead back to the mind. And whatever one you're in is the best one for you at the time. So there's so much correspondence, and we still are keeping up that dialogue and communication. We publish things together. And it's done not only with a spirit of shared contemplative mind practice, but also with a social agenda to some extent of saying if we as religious people, cultivating people, cannot get along together, how do we expect the world to come to any sense of peace and equanimity? So we have to lead the way in showing that these are all medicines to cure a common illness and not start wars over religions. So.
And to conclude, I was struck by the notion or the idea of codependent origination in Theravada with the abandonment of the Hegelian dialectic and the protagonist-antagonist traditions in Greek of the Eloquentia Perfecta pedagogy of the Jesuits, who have the agonist tradition rather than protagonist and antagonist, where when you're judged in debate, part of your grade is based on how much you have helped your opponent express their views so that together you can find the truth together.
I once had a dream I'm very dream oriented. Anyhow, the dream was there was this gathering, and it was all the ancient and sages from across the millennia, Greek, Roman, Buddhist, Taoist, Confucian. They were all in this big, like wonderful wedding reception place and having a hell of a good time with each other, joking and jostling, going at each other, saying, "Oh, you said this, but then you did it." And it was like just the image was that I imagine that they all would have gotten along famously, and it's only their followers that turn this into isms and fighting with nothing to do. But imagining, if you look at their virtue and their character, they would have just found a way to just have a good time and be together. So with that spirit, I guess, did you have something? Is it a simple question? Because usually yours aren't.
I think it's kind of simple. You can go with simply and you can go with deep profoundly. It depends on you. But 2025 is
You're
a
going to have to
pretty...
do it louder and clearer, even with the mic.
Okay. 2025
2025,
is gonna be a pretty special year.
okay.
I'm wondering if you can provide us any insights when we are going through a lot of changes and hardships for all the living beings here and also for all the people online.
Well, as a historian, there hasn't been a single era that wasn't tumultuous and earth-shaking. You can go back. I mean, you just go back. I was just reading Abe Lincoln today that we're living in tumultuous times. World War I, and we're looking. This is a earth-shattering, transformative era. There's never been a single era that hasn't been. So 2025 is right in line with everything else. However, I will give you, I don't know if this is advice, but something that's helped me. After we would do retreats or after a long time in the tranquility and purity and stillness of the monastery, we would all have to go back to whatever we were doing, either going to different way places or many of us going back to our regular lives. And the master would say, when you go out, be a bright lamp in dark places. Be a bright lamp in dark places. Don't let your light go out. And I carried that image with me as long as you keep that light going and you're a bright light, not only will you not succumb, but who knows, it might actually be infectious in a good way. So be a bright light in dark places is the best I can say. Be a bright light in dark times. Okay, let's do, speaking of lights, and we're going to do the transference in English. Oh. Right. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the triple jewel.